here. So today, again, as Sharon said, we're going to talk about dahlias. We'll go ahead and click over to the next slide here. I like to start some of these PowerPoints with a little history that people may not have known about, particular plants that they're growing. The dahlia is the national flower of Mexico. It's also native to the mountains of Mexico and Guatemala. Pretty high up sometimes. We don't think of them as being more of a cool season plant, but they do not like frost, but they actually do like a little bit cooler weather than our summers. However, they do just fine here. The Spanish conquistadors found the dahlias growing in the gardens of the Aztecs whenever they arrived. And then botanists with the Spanish found the tree dahlia, which, if you're not familiar with that, you do a little Google on that and see what that looks like. I've never grown one, but I may have to order one and see how that does in our area. But they actually use that for the flowers, and they also use it as a water source because the stems are fleshy. And those can grow 20 feet tall. I've even seen reports of them up to 30 feet tall in one season, but usually that's going to be down there in their native habitat where, the weather's just perfect for them. But I have seen, 10-foot, 12-foot specimens in people's gardens online that live closer to our zone. So maybe something that maybe we can give it a shot and see what they do for us in one season. The drawback for them is they bloom very late. So it'd be up in October before we would get blooms. And then you know what happens around that time. So our growing season could be a problem there. It took about 200 years from the time the Spanish arrived in South America or Central America before the dahlia actually made it back to Europe. You think about 200 years has been a very long time, but back then you got to think about transportation was months back and forth, and there was much more important things that they were trying to take back and forth, especially food crops and those kinds of things, which is why the dahlia actually ended up in Europe to start with. They are edible, believe it or not. I've never eaten one. I've never had the want to cook one of my dahlias up to see what they tasted like. But from what I've heard, they're not very tasty, so they didn't catch on as a food crop. And between 1810 to 1840, the dahlias were starting to be hybridized throughout Western Europe. And then the interest began to wane because they thought that the combination of colors and everything had already been finished, and they couldn't come up with any new colors. So they were like, well, that's all we can do with those. So the interest kind of waned in them after that. Then came a new dahlia that they hadn't seen before. In 1872, a box of dahlia roots were sent from Mexico to Holland. There's only one root that survived. It is the one that you see in the picture here. Not this exact one, but its predecessors or its ancestors. This single plant bloomed brilliant red, as you can see there in the flowers. And it did spark a resurgence in dahlia history because up to that time, the Europeans hadn't seen a red dahlia. So this is very important in the whole hybridization of dahlias and all the colors that we have now. This one is Dahlia. I know the online PowerPoint does not have it spelled out, but I wanted to make sure I pronounce it right. But this is Dahlia Eurasiae. If you do Latin, the J is a U sound, and then the U, all your vowels are long sounds. So Dahlia Eurasiae. It was crossed with the existing varieties in Europe, and it is that the varieties that were already there, plus this one, are the parents of all of our modern varieties and hybrids that we have today. And if you go online and you look at what's out there, it's an astronomical amount of plant material. So as far as planting, we want to go sometimes between mid-April through May here. Don't try to get any earlier than that because our soils need to be at least 60 degrees. Anything cooler than that, our soils are going to be wet at that time frame generally. If it's cool and wet for weeks on end there, you're going to get some rot. So just, wait until the weather's right before you put these out. They do prefer full sun to thrive. That's about 8 hours of direct sunlight. That's going to give you your best flowering. But if you want the flowers to last longer, especially in summer, you're going to want to give them a little afternoon shade. So if you can give them that 6 to 8 hours of full sun in the morning, and if you get some later afternoon shade, your flowers are going to last longer, especially in July and August. If you try to shade the plants, though, you're going to get some taller plants. So you may not want to do that because these will need staking. Another problem that we have, and I don't know that I even put it in the later part of the PowerPoint, but Japanese beetles will be an issue on these flowers at that time frame, as most of you all know if you've been gardening very much. Always take a soil test. You're going to hear that every time an extension agent talks about growing something, but that's going to let us know exactly what you're lacking in nutrients. It's going to tell us your pH. They do prefer a slightly acidic soil of about 6.5 to 7. In central Kentucky, that's pretty common. That's pretty much our native range of pH for most of us, but there are pockets that are more alkaline and more acidic. If you live in western, eastern Kentucky, you may even have a bigger fluctuation than that, depending on where you are. Because remember, the central part of the state is limestone-based soils, so our pH tends to stay right in that range, unless we need to add something to change that pH for a particular plant. You want to choose a warm, well-drained soil in a sunny location, and then one thing they do not like is wet feet. So you definitely need to have a well-drained soil. And if you have heavy clay, you're going to want to add compost or manure or peat or any other organic material, leaf mold, something like that, just to loosen that soil up, to give that soil more nutrients. It's going to help the tilth of it, and then it's also going to make it a lot easier for you later in the season when you need to dig these. If you'd like, you can mix a handful of bone meal into the hole before planting. This is going to be only if you've got a soil that's low in calcium. Again, remember I mentioned the limestone-based soils, usually our calcium is very high, so we don't have that problem. But if you take a soil test and it comes back that your calcium is low, you may want to put a little bone meal down that hole. That's going to give you your calcium. And you remember, calcium in plants holds the cells together, so they definitely need that, because if the cells are not held together, if there's a calcium problem, then you get rots and things. And for a tuber like this, that's going to be a bad thing to start out with. As far as your soil preparation, you definitely want to loosen that soil up in the bed, and then you want to dig your hole at least 4 to 6 inches deep. And depending on what varieties you plant, 18 to 24 inches apart. And then also the depth is going to depend on what size tubers you're planting. If you've got some really large ones that you dug from previous years, you may need to dig deeper than that to make sure you get them down in the soil. You can spread them out without putting them straight down, which will help you not have to dig as deep. There's also no reason to water these when you plant them, because we're going to have natural rainfall. And remember, if they're not, they haven't broken dormancy yet, they're not actively growing. So you've just got this tuber that's fleshy, full of water, setting in wet soil, that's not actively growing. So you can have some problems. So just let nature take its course after you plant them. I know some of these that you've stored over the winter are probably going to be a little bit shriveled, and that's fine. But we've had plenty of rain for them to be fine in the spring once you plant them. Also, there's no reason to mulch until your plants are up and growing, because remember, we want that soil to be warm, where this warm season plant can break dormancy. And then after it's actively growing, then you go in and put some mulch around it. If you do look there at the pictures, you can see you can see the old stem there. It's pointed out, and you can see the little eyes there at the base of where that's the actual stem where the tubers meet. You can see the little eyes around there. And then you have the actual tubers that are coming off of that. It's very important to notice those. We'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. Why knowing those parts is very important. As far as container growing, they do just fine, especially or only if you do the small or the dwarf varieties. The others are just too tall and too overpowering unless you have a very large pot, but we'll show you a picture of those in just a minute. Usually any container that's smaller than 12 by 12 is not going to be large enough for these, because these plants, even being little, actually produce a pretty significant amount of tuber growth each season. So anything smaller than that, they would be compacted and wouldn't do as well. So here's a taller dahlia, you can see, but it's in a large pot. These pots tend to maybe blow over. So if you want to make it heavier, there's a couple of things you can do. One of the things that is here, we usually would never recommend, but you can do it if you want to try it, which would be 1 part garden soil and 2 parts potting soil mixed together. And by loosening that up 2 to 1, that'll keep that from being so compacted. Remember, if you use regular garden soil in a container, it becomes pretty much concrete over a season. So definitely want to loosen it up a lot. Personally, I would rather just put some gravel or some stones in the bottom of that pot, get a heavier pot to start with. and then just put regular potting soil. That's going to be a lot easier for you to maneuver around, and it's just going to make sure you don't have any diseases or anything in that container that you may have had in your regular potting soil or your regular garden soil. Once the plants are growing and actively growing, you want to fertilize twice per month with a water-soluble fertilizer. And you can keep an eye on them for water. They will dry out quickly, especially you can see this container, there's a lot of plants in there, and dahlias don't like to compete a lot. So you want to make sure you keep plenty of nutrients and plenty of water if you're growing them in a mixed container like this, or in a container at all for that matter. Most dahlias, unless they're dwarf, are going to need staking because they're going to reach 3 feet or more, and they will flop over. We'll get a July thunderstorm and they'll blow straight over. The stems will break. Their stems are kind of hollow, so they're not near as sturdy as you think they would be. Anything with a large flower is also going to tend to fall over, even if we don't have a thunderstorm or a rainstorm. So it's good to think ahead of what kind of staking you're going to do on these larger varieties. You can use tomato cages, you can use metal rods, bamboo, posts, stakes, whatever you need to do to support these. I did put a few pictures in here where you could just see what some people have done. And some of these have done this because they're selling them for cut flowers. Others, maybe because they grow plants, dahlias to show, or maybe they're a hybridizer. There's lots of reasons why they would have such a fancy system on some of these to hold these up. But you can see a lot of people are doing bamboo and they're tying the plant directly to it. Others are doing a bamboo with some string tied, connecting the bamboo where the plants can grow up through it. The one on the side of the house there, you can see they're just using the bamboo that you can buy at the store. That's actually the plastic, and they're just staking each plant because they don't have that many. There's a tomato cage there at the bottom right, and then you can see on the left there, that's a cut flower operation there. They're going to let them grow up through that fencing. And this is a plastic net that you can buy that you can just string over some stakes and let the plants grow up through that. You could use regular metal fencing if you wanted, but they're just making sure their plants stay upright where they can get stems that they can cut. So fertilizing, if you're growing in the actual ground, you want to do not over fertilize these because too much nitrogen will cause a lack of flowers. It's also going to cause a weak plant, and it also can cause tubers to rot, especially if you were to apply too much nitrogen too late in the season. It's best to just use a basic fertilizer, 1010, 19. Obviously, you're going to change your rates of application based on, the higher the number, the less you would put because there's more active ingredient in there. But you may do this maybe monthly, May, June, July, and August. Do not fertilize after August because these plants need to let some of that nutrient get out of there. You don't want all that nice fleshy growth going into the winter or going into fall when the frost hits. And then you're going to dig those tubers and they're going to be fleshy and actively growing more than they should be. And it can cause them to rot a lot easier. You do want to work the fertilizer in lightly around the base of the plant. That's just maybe stretching it in and go about 6 to 12 inches from the stem. You don't want to get too close and maybe nick the stem or even a tuber that may have pushed up out of the soil. Weed control, there's so many things you can do for weed control, but for most of us, you can do this with hand weeding. You can also, after the plants are up growing, you can use preen. Actually, with these tubers, you can put it down even before they're actively growing because preen, remember, it prevents seed growth. So these larger tubers wouldn't have any trouble with the preen. If you've got grass in the bed and other weeds, you can use grass beater because it only kills grasses and doesn't kill broadleaves. Do not put a broadleaf herbicide in there though, because it'll kill your dahlias, and it also can be volatilized and up into other plants. So for me, 2,4-D never comes on the property. I'm not a big lawn person. As far as a few weeds don't bother me, but other people, if you've got a pristine lawn, that's something you're gonna have to think about. If they're putting down 2,4-D during the growing season on that lawn, you could get some problems with the herbicide volatilizing out and burning or twisting your dahlia plants as well. The biggest thing you can do after these are actively growing is just put you a good thick layer of mulch down around these plants, 3 to 4 inches. That's all that is needed. And I would just do some kind of organic mulch. I would avoid landscape fabrics, lava rocks, plastics, any of those kinds of things for several reasons. But the biggest reason is for the most part, you're going to be digging these, and if you put that stuff down, you're just going to have a problem digging these every year. Now, we'll talk about it a little more later, but sometimes people get by with not digging them for a season or two, but that's pure luck, or you've got a great location and we had a great winter. Few problems you're going to face, especially early in the seasons, the snails and slugs. They love this nice growth when it comes through. They'll even eat the tuber itself if they can get to it, but they'll chew holes in your leaves and chew your buds off. And this new growth coming out, it doesn't take much to chew that right off, and your plant's got to send up a whole new eye that has to break. So you want to make sure you keep these under control, especially if you know you've got these to start with. So you can either control that with the beer method, with taking a coffee can or a can and putting some beer in it and burying it down in the soil, so that the slugs can come to the lip of it, fall in and drown. You can use regular beer, or you can use near beer, whatever. It's the malt that actually they're coming to. The easiest and the fastest way to control these is with slug bait, and it's granular, and you just sprinkle it around the plants. The slugs or snails will eat that, and usually it's quick. And then you won't have a slug or snail problem. Just keep in mind that the active ingredient in that is carbaryl, which is 7. You want to make sure that your pets or whatever won't eat that. I've never had any pets eat it. It's pretty fine. It's not as big as it used to be, bigger like chicken feed, but now it's more like a chicken crumble size. And I haven't had any eat it, but doesn't mean they wouldn't. But just keep in mind that if you've got pets or livestock or anything, you want to make sure they can't get to that. Another big problem that you might face, especially if you're in a protected location and we have a hot, dry summer, are spider mites. This is one of the most common pests of dahlias. Almost always, especially if you see them growing in a greenhouse, if you look closely, you're going to probably see a few, and you want to take them home. But you think about in a greenhouse, we don't have natural rainfall. It's a lot easier for these to get started in some place like that. Outside, you may still have some, but if it's a normal summer, with plenty of rain and wind, the population is knocked down and kept down pretty well. But if you're in a protected location, maybe between 2 walls in a corner or something like that, and we haven't had a lot of rainfall, and there's a population of spider mite already there, you can get a huge population that's built up pretty quickly, and you can see the foliage there starts to bronze and die, because these little spider mites actually suck the chlorophyll out of the leaf, and so it basically renders it unable to photosynthesize, so the leaf turns brown and dies. There's a couple things you can do with these to help control these. You can do a swift spray of water through the under the leaves through the plant 3 days in a row, and then you can apply some kind of miticide or insecticide that might help. Insecticidal soap will help some, and it actually will cover the mite and suffocate it. Malathion is labeled for spider mites. I've not noticed it working great, but especially if you have a large population of mites like this. You could also try neem oil, because it works similar to the way that the soap would work. If it's bad enough and you grow a lot of dahlias or a lot of roses and a lot of other things for that matter, floramide is great. It's expensive. I can tell you up front, it's very expensive. But you only use 1/4 teaspoon to a gallon of water. So it goes a long way, but it is great because it kills bad spider mites and doesn't kill the other spider mites that actually feed on the bad spider mites. That last picture there is kelthane. That used to be one of the cheapest miticides we could buy, and it worked pretty well, but it is no longer on the market, I don't believe. I didn't remember being able to find it last year, and I think it's gone off the market. Another pest that you're probably going to have, a couple pests, are thrips and cucumber beetles. They're mainly going to be a nuisance, but they eat on the flowers and the flower petals, and does cause them to look bad sometimes if the population is too high. For most of us, it's not a big deal because we'll get new flowers and we don't pay that big attention to it. But for somebody that's going to a show with growing these for show, it is a huge problem. But to control those, usually it's going to be malathion. Or 7, something like that. But with 7, or most of these, you can't spray these directly on a bloom, even though that's where they're feeding. So you're gonna make sure you're gonna have to target the actual bud before it opens, because remember, we don't want to spray a flower an insecticide because of our pollinators. You can also use some pyrethrum, maybe insecticidal soaps if you want. The insecticidal soap is probably going to be your safest one as far as pollinators go here as well. I didn't include the Japanese beetles in the pest there, but they will be a major pest on these while they're in flower. I know a lot of people actually cut the flowers once they just start to open and just take them indoors and let them finish opening rather than have the Japanese beetles eating on their flowers. I have not noticed the Japanese beetles really preferring the leaves much. It's more the flowers that they're generally after. Another one is powdery mildew, and this is a disease, not an insect problem, but you're going to find these on dahlias almost every year later in the season. It depends on the weather and where you've got them planted. If you don't have good airflow in the bed, sometimes it's just a problem with dahlias later in the season. It's not going to kill the plant. It makes them look bad, like make them drop leaves. It won't kill the tuber. But if you want to control this, especially if you notice it's going to be a little earlier than normal, because it's just going to progressively get worse, you can try a couple fungicides. Something containing chlorothalonil or mecazeb is protectant, which you can spray before you have much tissue that's infected, and it will kill the spores where it won't spread as much. There's a lot of name brands that have the one or both of those, or not both, but one or the other fungicide chemicals in there. Or you can also buy systemic fungicides such as Immunox or Cleary's 3336. Cleary's is probably your #1 fungicide against powdery mildew on ornamentals especially. And I've even seen now that they're selling a formula of Cleary's, the active ingredient in Cleary's that also has chlorothalonil in it. And so basically it's 2 fungicides and you're getting the protectant from the chlorothalonil and you're getting the systemic from the Cleary's. I don't know that I would go all out if you're just going to go a few dahlias for any of that. I'd probably go with the chlorothalonil by itself because you can buy it pretty easily at any of the big box stores or farm stores in Kentucky. But if you want something a little stronger, you can go online. If you've got a bunch of roses and things you're growing as well, then it may be worth it to go ahead and invest in one of these systemic fungicides. Also, botrytis blight, and by looking at the pictures there, botrytis blight is at the top. The powdery mildew is at the bottom, but botrytis blight usually attacks your leaves. It also can attack the flowers, especially if the weather's very moist. Deadheading and getting that stuff out of the bed will help. But usually a fungicide is not needed for botrytis blight. It'll usually go away on its own when the weather straightens up. But if you do want to, you can use chlorothalonil and mecazeb for that one as well. This is something most of you probably would be scared to do, but it's something that's very important to do if you're going to grow, some of the larger dahlias. You want to pinch that bud out at the top there. You can see where she's got her fingers. This is going to help produce a shorter, bushier plant. It's also going to give you a lot more flowers and stems for cutting. You'll wait till the plant's about 18 to 20 inches tall, and you're just going to pinch that top bud out. And what will happen is you'll get side branches from, you can see where those leaves are connected to the stem. Those are nodes there, and you'll get buds to break from there, and you'll get more branches branching and more flowers. Now, I will make one note on this. If you're wanting to try to grow the dinner plate dahlias and get those large, extra big flowers, then you're probably going to leave that bud in the middle because you're going to let that plant grow up to produce the one biggest flower that you can produce at the top. I've grown dinner plate dahlias before, and I've done several different things to them, but it was only one year that I actually ever got one that was actually the size of a dinner plate. It's very weather dependent for us. If we have a cool July, you've got a much better shot at it than if we have our typical, hot July. So just keep that in mind. If you want to try that to grow that huge one, go right ahead. I've done it, but I was lucky with the July that year. And I will tell you what, the variety that will give you the best shot at the dinner plate size blooms in our climate is Kelvin Floodlight. Well, I shouldn't say it's the best one that's easy to find and cheap. I should have put that in there because some of the dahlias people that are just large growers of dahlias, they've got some great varieties out there, but most of us are not going to want to spend the money for those. The best time for cut flowers is to go ahead and cut them in the morning while it's still cool, just like you would any other flower. The one thing that you can do to help these last the longest, though, it sounds crazy, but it needs to be done to these. You want to place the cut stem in 2 to 3 inches of very hot water, and that's water that's anywhere from 160 to 180 degrees Fahrenheit. And then just let them sit in the stem sit in that hot water and allow it to cool for at least 1 hour. Well, what happens is that hot water, it causes that plant to take up more water. And as it cools, that water stays up into the stems and it keeps that bloom more hydrated longer. They'll call that kind of setting the bloom. And it'll make it last longer, maybe up to 4 to 6 days longer. So if you're wanting to cut and bring them indoors, that's a way that you can get them to last longer. If you've ever cut dahlias, they usually don't last very long indoors if you don't do this method. Also, be sure to deadhead your old blooms to keep your new flowers coming during the growing season. Dahlias can be they can't overwinter outdoors in Kentucky. I've done it. I know other people have done it, but I had an exceptional location. Particular varieties makes it a big difference too. But I'm telling you, you're taking a huge risk if you really want to keep these from year to year. So the best thing to do is go ahead and dig them. You never know what kind of winter we're going to have. You never know how rainy it's going to be. There's just a lot of factors there. So go ahead and dig them in the fall. Winter will kill most of our dahlias, especially even if the rot doesn't get them from being wet and cool all winter. A lot of times our ground will freeze and it'll kill the tubers. You know, a freeze deeper than 6 inches in wet soil is going to completely kill your dahlias. But you're going to think about, and I'll show you the picture of the tubers earlier. It doesn't even have to freeze that deep. You only have to freeze a couple of inches and kill that top of that tuber, and you're not going to get a dahlia back from that. So again, storing it indoors is your best bet to make sure you have these year after year. So after the first freeze, you want to cut the dahlia tops off, and then you want to maybe leave 3 or 4 inches of stem there, because it's a good handle to make sure all of your tubers are connected to one spot. And then you're going to put them in containers. If you've already got them growing in a container, though, you can just cut that top of that dahlia off and take the container indoors. And then you don't have to dig at all. And then you really don't have to repot the next year either, but you can just bring it out, water it, and let it start growing again. Make sure you fertilize it, though. So for winter storage, a covering of slightly dampened peat moss, maybe sand, sawdust, or even shavings works. You want to cover them with something, because left at air temperature, they do shrivel and sometimes they can dry out too much and die. So a little peat or something like that, just covering them over really does protect them from the dry air. It's a good idea to line the container with several layers of newspaper. That newspaper will absorb your excess moisture, especially if maybe a tuber rots and you need something to absorb some of the extra moisture. It's kind of like, you know, when rotten apple will spoil the whole bag. Same thing with these dahlias as they're stored. Also, you want to never store them in a sealed plastic bag, because they will sweat, and that's just going to cause some rot to set in. And then if you can, store them in a cool, dark place at 40 to 50 degrees. Remember, it cannot freeze in this location. It needs to be cool, dark, and dry. Now, if you can't get a 40 to 50 degree cool, dark place, if you've got a cool, dark 65 or 70 degree spot, that'll work just fine as well. Just know that they may start to sprout a little early for you, and that's not going to be a huge problem for most of us. Also, if it's too warm and dry, they will wrinkle and shrivel. A little bit of wrinkle and shriveling is not bad. Too much, though, can be a problem. Just be sure to not let these go down to freezing. Some people want to store them in a garage or something. Make sure that that garage is heated enough that it doesn't freeze in there. As far as dividing, they can be done in the spring or the fall. I personally prefer the spring before I'm going to plant, because if that whole plant's all connected, all the water can go from one tuber to the next. If maybe one's smaller and it's shriveling a little bit, it can get, you know, fed a little bit off of one of those bigger tubers. So, you know, for me, it works better to keep them connected for the winter, and then divide them in the spring whenever I'm planting. There is a warning here, and you can see that this is not a tuber like a potato, which eyes all around where you can cut it up and you'll get a sprout coming off of it. You have to have a piece of eye from that stem area. You see this, the old stem there, and you see the little eyes around that where the tubers actually finger into that. You've got to have a piece of that stem with an eye connected to that tuber for you to get a new plant. So if one of these tubers breaks off down below that eye, or off the stem down below the eye, that tuber is never going to grow anything. It doesn't have a bud on it. So make sure when you divide these that you cut through that main stem to make sure that whatever tuber you're going to have to still connect it has an eye off of that stem there that can give you new growth. Also, you can allow the cut surface to dry overnight or just a few hours before you plant. It's not a huge deal, but it does help to kind of let that heal over a little bit. As far as types, I'm not going to run talk about each one of these, but I put these in here where people could see, you know, what kind of blooms that you could actually get on dahlias. You can see the single flower there. There's an anemone flowered one there under that. Looks kind of like an anemone, if you're all familiar with those plants. And you can see there's all different colors on all of these different flower types. There's a collarette there. You can see it has a little bit of a semi-double in the middle. The water lily there below that is a really popular flower form in dahlias as well. I think that's Tahitian sunset there, which is really pretty bright pink and yellow flower. Then the decorative there at the top, that one's very common. You'll see that in a lot of big box stores sold. It's nice big flowers on that one, and then the ball types, they're pretty common, sold at the big box stores as well. Down below that, there's just so much out there, and you see the explanation there about the length and all that, and that's what they use whenever someone takes a dahlia to show. They have to go through all these different the length of the petals and all that to see if it actually fits in to the actual category that they're putting it into. There's a pom-pom there at the top, and then there's the cactus flower, which is another very common one that you'll see at pretty easy to find, even mail order or even at some of the nurseries and things. And all of these are relatively, I would say, tall varieties, maybe 2-3 feet tall, depending on the varieties. We have the semi-cactus, which to me doesn't look that much different than the cactus, but you know, it's in a category. And then we have the fimbriated there. You can see at the bottom where the petals are actually kind of twisted and split. It's kind of an interesting, almost looks like the hostess snowball cake, I think, for some reason to me. And then we have the miscellaneous categories, which basically is just the flower form that doesn't fit into any of the other groups. So they'll put them in the miscellaneous. Then we have the star there. You can see where the petals single and they actually rolled up like a star. And then we have the double orchid. And a lot of these, for most of us, is not a big deal. We don't care as far as what categories they go in. We just want to grow them. But I'm just trying to put this out there where you can see a lot of different flower forms out there in dahlias, not to mention colors. And then we have the peony type there. That's more of a single with a few extra petals there. It kind of seems like some of the single peony flowers out there, but this variety here, if you look there closely, you can see it actually has dark foliage as well. Oh, as far as questions go, we'll do questions. I guess they're going to do questions after the recording stopped, but I did want to stop here and put some of the information for the PowerPoint. So the places it came, it didn't come out of my head, there's some links there if you want to go to some of those. Those are pretty nice there to check out.